Hello, everyone, and welcome to our second installment of First Sunday Fireside Chats. I'm your host, Lance Blair, Docent Training Coordinator and Communications Manager here at Historic Camden. Today, we're going to be turning our focus to a topic I think many of you will find interesting. Camden's Colonial Regional Medical Hospital, which was obviously very prominent during the British occupation here in Camden. And to do that, to discuss that, we're going to be joined by our very special guest here, Dr. Jim Piecuch. Jim, it is wonderful having you. We appreciate you being here. I'd like to pick your brain a bit today, if you don't mind. So, sure. So, as I was just saying, the British occupied Camden. No secret there, but the hospital is vital to the British and the Continental. So, could you talk a bit about why it was such a vital part of the occupation, but also to the war cause in general?
Okay, sure. I'd love to. Well, I'll quote historian Kenneth Lewis, who said that the British General Hospital dominated Camden during the occupation and was the largest medical facility in the interior of South Carolina, which is pretty impressive in itself, quite a bit, considering aside from a few doctors who lived and practiced in the town before the Revolution, there was really no medical facility in the area. So this had to be built from scratch and quite large. And it was because this wasn't really expected by the British, even though they had campaigned earlier in Georgia, and some of the units that came to South Carolina had actually been organized in East Florida and St. Augustine. The South Carolina disease environment was worse. Popular saying in the 18th century was that South Carolina is in the spring of paradise, in the summer of hell, and in the autumn of hospital. And what's that? Yeah, better than I can do it. That's one of the quote, and several other people had noticed that. And this was not the natural environment, the disease environment in South Carolina. This was a product of colonization. Colonists brought with them all kinds of diseases: smallpox, yellow fever, malaria, measles, influenza. And to make it worse, they also brought creatures that spread those diseases. Mosquitoes came, the ones that carried malaria, if you want to get into the scientific aspect, they came with the colonists. Cockroaches, rats, all those were not native, but they came to this environment, they thrived, and so in addition to bringing disease, they also brought mechanisms, living mechanisms to spread that disease. And as a result, the native peoples were decimated primarily by smallpox. African Americans imported here in the first decades, 1/3 died in the first 3 years. And Europeans also suffered heavily. So this was a very difficult place to live in the colonial era, and while it had improved somewhat with development, as you know, right? If you walk in the back along the nature trail, a lot of water buildup, swampy area, and that's perfect for mosquitoes who carry these diseases.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
It made it all the more understandable that people were miserable trying to make a life here, considering that disease was running rampant. It's interesting you make that comment, because often on tours I'll tell people that, musket balls didn't kill nearly as many people as disease did here. This was just, disease was prominent.
Yeah.
Prevalent, absolutely.
Yeah, and the Revolutionary War made it worse because now you have people coming from other areas, and the most notable example, in spring of 1779, Brigadier General Casimir Pulaski is sent south with his legion to reinforce the Continental Army, and they march through Camden right here, and some of them have smallpox. And so they left it, and they also brought it to Charleston in the spring of 1780. Smallpox was still in Charleston, not at a real epidemic level, but enough to be a concern. Then when the British captured Charleston on May 12th, they march in, their soldiers get smallpox, and they bring it here and to 96 and to Truro and to Augusta, Georgia, all the garrisons they're establishing after Charleston's surrender. So, and of course now they're coming, most of them are coming from northern climate. They've been in garrison in New York and Pennsylvania. So they're coming to this disease environment. So they're going to deal with the local diseases as well
the change of environment, climate too, on top of all that, the added humidity only made, especially respiratory issues, I mean, all the more fun to do.
Yeah. So smallpox is the first problem the British have, and they need a hospital to place these patients. So they used the kitchen building at the Kershaw House. Kitchen buildings were always detached from the larger homes in that era because you didn't want to have a fire going around the clock in your house in the summer. But that soon proved too small as more and more soldiers became sick. And so they took over Joseph Kershaw's store on the other side of Broad Street. And this was described as a substantial building. Apparently, archaeology bears up this was used as a hospital. And so they began putting the sick there, not only the sick from smallpox, but at first it was the outlying garrisons. Chirrut Hill, the Scottish Highlanders there were stricken with malaria. What they called the ague, they would get a fever, and then that fever would give you chills, so you would shiver and shake. As a side effect, while malaria was rarely fatal, it made you more susceptible to other diseases. So a combination, malaria and smallpox,
Weak immune system and just.
yeah, so you could die. The problem is nobody understood germ transmission. So when Chirrut was first ordered closer to Camden, then finally Lord Rawdon ordered him to come to Camden. He himself had to come because he was too sick to do his duty. So all these sick soldiers from the 71st are here. Well, they put them in the hospital next to the soldiers with smallpox, and next to the ones who have yellow fever, next to the ones who have dysentery, and so the disease spreads because there's just no understanding that. Yeah. And Rawdon himself becomes sick. They did have a treatment for malaria that had been discovered by the Spanish earlier in colonizing farther south. It was called Peruvian bark, and it was bark of the cinchona tree, which contained quinine, which is still what we use to treat malaria. Rawdon himself became very sick, and he had to take heavy doses of what we call bark to recover. And so you had all of these sick people here. Eventually, the garrison of Camden, which had avoided malaria, now begins to come down in the summer. So on the eve of the Battle of Camden, Cornwallis wrote this and explaining his decision to fight Gates. He had, on the rolls, there are 845 sick British soldiers, to whom Cornwallis said he would have to leave about 800 behind because they were too sick to be moved.
That's substantial.
Yeah,
That's substantial.
so you've got all these sick people here, and then you have the Battle of Camden. You've got roughly 240 British soldiers wounded, most of whom need hospital treatment, and you've got another 240 wounded Americans who were captured by the British, who also need hospital treatment. So now they're brought in. The Americans are kept separately. I don't know how it was not possible for Kershaw's store to house 800 British wounded, let alone another roughly 500 on top of that after this battle. So we can only imagine they took over other buildings, pitched tents in open areas, and at this point, the British turned to American soldiers to help with the treatment. There are some American surgeons who were captured at the Battle of Camden. Gates sends some through the lines under flag of truce to treat the American wounded, and the British also dredge up an interesting local figure named Dr. Thomas Charlton. He had gone to treat the wounded at the Battle of Waxhaws at the end of May. When he came back to get more supplies, he found the British had suspected him of still aiding the American cause. They had seized his medical equipment. Now they said, well, here's your medical equipment back. We need your support. Another interesting thing that the British did, and we know this partly circumstantially because they did it in other places, but also because Samuel Mathis in his diary recovered some of his slaves from that situation who had escaped. The British used fugitive slaves who had come with them as nurses and hospital attendants to make up for the lack, because Cornwallis wrote shortly after the Battle of Camden that most of his medical personnel were sick. So you can imagine this hospital where you've got American surgeons and their assistants, British surgeons and their assistants, residents, and then large numbers of African American former slaves who are working under supervision to try
All
to treat
hands on
the
deck, basically. Everyone was needed and everyone played a part. So that's fascinating, but all the more interesting to think that everyone had to come together when it really mattered. I mean,
Yeah.
this was the battle only exacerbated the issue, which is all the more interesting that it was somehow. And I've always wondered how they did manage to inhabit so many soldiers, so many injured, so many sick and wounded in such a small space, which all the more furthers the idea that they were having to literally build facilities to house all these people that were getting added one on top of another. So, and all the more that were being able to pass and transmit those diseases. So, never-ending cycle.
Yeah, and what Cornwallis decides to do, the British have a general hospital in Charleston, which has a fair number of sick soldiers, but they're not facing the influx of battle casualties. We should note that these battle casualties aren't just from the Battle of Camden. 2 days after Camden, you have Fishing Creek, and some of Tarleton's men are wounded, and some of Sumter's captured men are wounded, and they're brought in. And when there are skirmishes with Marion or with other partisan groups, this is where the hospital is. This is where the wounded of both sides are taken.
It was a constant influx of just more bodies being so tightly knit, so tightly. It's amazing that they were able to actually find staff to handle that, and it makes it more understandable they were pulling from slaves, from soldiers, from doctors from both sides to try and work together and collaborate. So.
Yeah, and what Cornwallis does as soon as possible, especially because the least badly wounded Americans, as they start to recover, begin to escape from the hospital because they're not really under guard. And he says this is only going to give more strength to our enemy. So what he starts doing is, as both British and American soldiers begin to recover, not completely but enough to travel, he moves them down the river to McCord's Ferry, and from there they have a wagon system set up to transport them overland to the hospital in Charleston. The British go separately, and the first thing Cornwallis said he did was get rid of what he called all the bad amputated cases. Because if you had a compound fracture from a musket wound or even from an injury from falling off a horse, standard treatment at the time was amputation of the limb. So, and then if it got infected, we couldn't treat it.
Come a long way.
Yeah.
Come quite a long way.
Yeah, especially when you remember, when this is one reason why so many people thought that wounds another standard treatment. The British had started to get away from this. They were a little more advanced in terms of their study of human anatomy and surgical practices. But what they would do if you were shot at a flesh wound, say with a serious through-and-through musket wound in your upper left arm, the standard practice was to enlarge the wound. So they might cut a slash across it or even two, and then go in and probe to make sure there was nothing left in there. They did, when it was available, use opium as a painkiller, but that has its own problems. And once this was done, as you were recovering, to speed your recovery, they would give you purgatives of various types. One of them that was very common was various types of laxative. Which doesn't exactly help, and leads to dehydration. They would also give you problematics, which make you vomit. And then if that didn't seem to help, and this is one of the reasons George Washington died from his medical treatment, or at least was boosted along, they believed that body fluids had to stay in balance. They call them humors.
Yes.
And if the humors were out of balance, then you would be sick, physically or in some cases psychologically. And since they couldn't drain the bottle, which was one of the humors that they couldn't blood, they would bleed you. So if you're sick, you've got this bullet wound and they've slashed it open, and now they've got you vomiting to help you recover. And indeed, you're not recovered, well, we'll cut your other arm and take some blood out.
Tensions, I suppose.
Yeah.
And it's, and I imagine a lot of that, and it's interesting, we do have a lot better understanding of the medical field now. And a lot of that was based out of, I imagine, Hippocrates studies in ancient Greece, and you mentioned the humors. So how was the treatment different in Camden versus say to the hospital in Charleston? Was it vastly different, or did they operate most of the same way?
It would have been most of the same way. Generally, the best surgeons in Britain who had studied with Robert and John Hunter, who were sort of the pioneers beginning in the 1740s. And John Hunter is interesting because he came to the conclusion he thought he could learn more by joining the army as a surgeon in 1760. And it's sort of a great story. He is treating British wounded after a battle. They're on this island and taking part of an island off the coast of France, and was fighting back and forth. And so 5 days after the battle, he finds a group of French soldiers who had been taken prisoner. They had just been found, they had been hiding, and they had all been, in his description, severely wounded. And he noticed that the French prisoners without medical treatment recovered better. They all recovered from their wounds rather than the British wounded who had surgical treatment. And that's when he decided that in terms of treating wounds from muskets and bayonets, that type of thing, that less is more.
Right.
But that hadn't really gotten around very far in Britain at the time, let alone the colonies.
We're traveling slow, of course.
Yeah, I mean, William Shippen Jr. from Philadelphia did study with John Hunter, but again, you're sort of anytime you try to make a change, you give your voice crying in the wilderness. And so the hospital in Charleston last year wouldn't have been very different. They might have been a little less aggressive in treatment. There were some, better trained surgeons supervising, but generally, your best surgeons wanted to have a private practice and charge nice fees in Citrus Home in London and go to their coffee houses with other entertainment, not come campaigning here.
Absolutely.
So, and of course, a lot of American surgeons. Basically, if you want to be a surgeon, can you afford a set of surgical tools and a box of medicine? You're a surgeon if you want to call yourself.
You use that.
Yep. So, they did. The Continental Congress did try to weed out these people beginning in the fall of 1776, but whether you're an American hospital or British hospital, whether it's in New York, Philadelphia, Charleston, the treatment is pretty much the same.
And medicine was, that's an interesting point. Medicine was almost universal to an extent, that makes sense. That specialized medicine was so not just under practice, but under funded, under researched. People didn't understand the idea of specialized medicine, so everything had a basic medical treatment. There's a story we're in McCaw's Tavern here. John McCaw's son graduated medical school, I think it was in 1 year, which nowadays, unless you're Doogie Howser, it's probably not happening anytime soon. It's a lot more complicated than that. So it's interesting to think that as simple as having your own tools and being able to open your own practice would be such a simplistic thing. So.
And actually, that leads to an interesting point that a local doctor who was working in the hospital, in the American hospital, the British operated the hospital until they evacuated Camden in early May of 1781. Large group of wounded came in after the Battle of Rockford's Hill, 58 wounded British soldiers and 30 some odd captured American soldiers who had been wounded and had been evacuated by their own force. So they were brought here, and actually Greene and Rawdon got along pretty well because William Washington's famous ride that he was supposed to strike the British line. Instead, he attacks basically a first aid station, and he takes a bunch of surgeons prisoner. And Greene releases them, these British surgeons. So Rawdon very graciously arranges that a lot of American surgeons. He says, okay, they weren't taken prisoner under really legitimate circumstances. They're prisoners nonetheless. So, you sent these 11 guys back, surgeons and surgeons. I'll arrange for some of these people who were held in Charleston, some for nearly a year, to be exchanged. And it took a little while, but it gave some needed medical personnel back to the American Army. So the Americans take over the hospital, and they ran it, at least until March of 1782. That was the last document I could find referring to it. At that point, Green had established his hospital, which was right outside Charleston. So he established his hospital, moved the patient, but it was on the plantation.
Now, Rocktown, I believe, was that, or is that different?
Rocktown was the backcountry loyalist refugees settlement outside of Charleston.
Gotcha. So that was, there were a lot of sick and wounded, I believe, that were in Rocktown.
Yeah.
Did that play into the occupation in terms of occupancy of the hospitals, Camden or Charleston, in terms of having to treat all those influx of more people on top of that, if that makes sense?
Yeah, that definitely strained British resources. Lieutenant Colonel Balfour, the commandant of Charleston, Fitz, to say politely, is all these loyalist refugees. They're still on the payroll because most of the men have rank in the loyalist militia, but a lot of them can't do duty because they're sick. A lot of the surgeons and the medical personnel. That was one way to pretty much get forgiveness, despite the fierceness of the Civil War between rebels and loyalists. Both sides tended to be forgiving of doctors because they needed them. So
It's a necessity.
yeah,
Job security.
and so a lot of the loyalist doctors who had been in the militia or in some of the provision units, we're going to go away to Charleston. We're giving up our home, our land, everything. We'll just make our peace, and they need us. We'll just, doesn't matter whoever we can take care of. So, yeah, so that put a big strain on the British resources in terms of having to provide care for all of these people and their families.
Absolutely. And I mean, there was some, it was interesting, you mentioned earlier about medicine understanding and things like opening the wound further to try and, or bleeding someone to balance the bodily fluids. So I'm fascinated by this, and I'm curious to see where it would play into it. But Edward Jenner was doing a lot of research in terms of inoculation, vaccination. Did any of that play into, and there's a famous story about Washington wanting to have his troops vaccinated, inoculated. How did that play into the overall efforts of trying to protect the troops, or what effect it might have actually had over?
Okay, that's interesting because we had an incident here in Camden involving that. And our local doctor, one of our local doctors, Thomas Charlton, was involved in that. The British were strong advocates of inoculation, and they had the material to do that. Washington also believed in it. South Carolina was a little reluctant. In 1760, the legislature made it illegal to inoculate the smallpox because people still thought that you're giving them smallpox. So that was a problem. Boozall Johnson, who was a New Jersey doctor, Patrick Ferguson, was captain of Kings Mountain, was asked to inoculate some people when he was a captive in North Carolina. But while Charlton is here, he has come in after the Battle of Camden. He continues to work at the hospital. After the British leave, he's actually going to be made head of the General Hospital in Camden for several months. So Charlton is here. In comes a loyalist regiment, the Royal North Carolina Regiment, commanded by Colonel John Hamilton. Hamilton is a pre-war friend of Charlton. They know each other. So Hamilton says to Charlton, "Hey, Tom, would you be willing to vaccinate my troops before we leave Camden on campaign?" Charlton thinks about it, and as he explained later, he said, this was a way for me to get the vaccine so I could also give it to my family and to a lot of other Camden residents, because they just said, here, a whole bunch of vaccine. So he says, sure, he vaccinates the Royal North Carolinians, he vaccinates some family, he vaccinates a lot of people in Camden. He thinks he's done a good thing. So he's in charge of the hospital. Another doctor who had come into the American lines about the time of the Battle of Camden and who was still working at this hospital, Dr. Robert Johnston, he had earlier served in the North. He decides in the summer of 1781, terrible timing because the Battle of Utah Springs occurs on September 8th, and all the American wounded, a lot of captured British wounded began to arrive here. They're backed up at McCord's Ferry. Greene is sending his aides down, trying to find transportation, trying to find wagons to get these poor wounded people here. And Johnston has Charlton arrested and taken to Charlotte for trial for giving aid to the enemy. What Charlton does, he writes to Green, and apparently he's released, we don't know the order, but he was never put on trial, court martial for that, but he writes to Green, says, hey, yeah, I helped them, but it was a way for me to help other people as well, and I helped a friend. He said, look at all the service I did. He listed all the service he did for the wax staff in Camden and in the hospital here, and he says, I've been doing all of this. He said that before the British left, before the evacuation, they thought I was spying for the Americans. They burnt my house. So, and yeah, and I mean, Rod wasn't really a house burner compared to some of the other British officers. So, for Rod to burn his house, they must have really been suspicious. And but Charlton was, punished with it. He wasn't, he was taken to Charlotte under guard under arrest. So that was as far as his punishment went. Apparently, he was released. I don't think there's no evidence that he worked at the hospital afterward, which it was too bad to lose a skilled doctor. With Utah Springs coming on, and especially after Utah Springs, and Daniel Green's friend it because he has all these wounded now in Camden. The Continental Army, unlike the British, is constantly scrambling to try to find adequate supplies of medicine. And Green is writing to the state governors, writing to the governor of North Carolina and Virginia, saying, please, send us supplies, send us money. He said, if you can see all these people who live in their country and are suffering under these horrible conditions, and he doesn't get much help. And he writes to Robert Morris, who's a friend of his, who's the finance officer for the Continental Congress, and Morris refuses to provide a lot of the medicine or the funds that Green wants, but Morris makes a good point. He said, and he's sort of forward thinking here, and it plays in with what Dr. Samuel Vickers said, so I'll move on from that, but Morris writes to Green, and he says, I'm looking at these lists of medicines that your doctors have asked for. Wine, rum, tea, coffee, sugar, chamomile, all these things. And he says, they don't do, the doctors can say what they want. I just don't see the medicinal value in paying for a lot of this. And Samuel Vickers, who was working in the hospital here, sort of came to the same conclusion. He wrote to Green afterwards, saying, all these things that now you're finally sending us some coffee and some wine and everything. He said, I really think that these soldiers, if we don't crowd them, we get them some air. He said, and serve them a nutritious but easy to handle diet like milk and rice, will recover sooner than with all of these other medicines. So this is really a smart idea that Vickers has, and he claimed that his experience proved that it did work better. So sometimes necessity is the mother of invention. Well, gee, I can't pump wine down this guy's throat, and I can't give him coffee and then put sugar cubes in his mouth. And, well, how about some rice and milk? Geez,
Something's gotta work.
yeah,
Trial and error.
yeah.
So I'll tell you what. How about if you're good, we'll take some questions.
Okay.
And I'll pause for a moment and I'll check here and see if we have any questions from anyone. I don't know if we have any questions. Anyone have any questions for Jim? Anybody out there watching have questions? I'm seeing so far. I want to keep you here all day and answer questions, but it's a good time for it. Just walking the encyclopedia of knowledge. Had many conversations. We were talking about earlier. We had many conversations over the years. I have learned quite a lot from those conversations. So we'll give everybody a chance to have that same opportunity to ask questions.
Sure. Well, I have to say, I wasn't an expert on this. I had gone through the Cornwall's papers for other projects. I've gone through the green papers for other projects, and just sort of, was looking for the medical information, if you want to call it that, at the time. So I didn't pay a whole lot of attention to it. And then, when we began working on
those types of things, you just get to learn all kinds of new. Not new, these things exist, obviously, they're new to you, if that makes sense. And as a teacher yourself, a professor, that the sort of joy of seeing someone, that thing click, and it's just, I know when I was a student, I always enjoyed those moments. So, as the educator yourself, it's probably a nice feeling to see someone take that and carry it on to someone else. And that's what it's all about. You know, we talked about that last month. It's about giving everyone a chance to learn. Maybe pick something up and become an educator themselves. So we hope that they will do that. So no one's popping up with questions. So if we don't have anything else you want to add, Jim? I mean, please feel free. No.
I think it's actually, when you look at, you know, what Camden is in 1780 when the British get here, with no medical facilities, a few doctors, and you look at all the literally thousands of people who came through here.
Right.
And the situation during the American period of running general hospitals, the same as during the British period. You have a skirmish somewhere. The wounded from both sides are brought here. When reinforcements come to Greene from the north, we have an account of the North Carolina militia, where one of the officers writes to Greene, and he says, I'm 20 miles north of Camden along the Wateree River. 2/3 of my men are sick, so I'm sending the worst cases, 20 of the worst cases, to the hospital under guard, because there's still loyalists that can be both sides of the kind of partisans and raiding. And he said, I gotta get them to the hospital so we can treat them. So when you figure all of the people who came through here and all of the effort that was put in, and knowledge or lack of knowledge about things like germ transmission, and you probe a wound with your surgical instruments on one patient, and you went to the next patient, and with your hands, and you didn't have gloves, and you didn't wash your hands because they didn't understand germ transmission. We knew all we had to contend with. It's really quite an achievement that so many of the sick and wounded on both sides came here and got halfway decent treatment and were able to recover. And then, you know, ideas like Vickers and, hey, man, let's try spacing the patients instead of crowding them, and giving them nutritious food instead of bleeding them and pouring, you know, these chemicals into them. And there were some developments that were positive, and just the achievement of treating so many people who recovered, sometimes because of, and other times in spite of the care they got.
And I mean, it really is in many instances, especially at that time, trial by fire. I mean, it's really trial and error. You don't know what does work until you know what doesn't. If that makes sense.
Yeah.
It's interesting to see how vital Camden was in the medical field during that time, because I don't think people often realize that there were so many thousands of people, not just soldiers necessarily all the time, but people that were injured, wounded, sick, that were in and out of Camden. And this was a prime location to learn about medicine.
And when these hospitals had space under the British and the Americans, you're a local resident, you needed hospital care, they took you in.
Absolutely.
And that again, in wartime, being willing to treat the civilian population when you can, was a pretty decent gesture.
And it's great to know that both the British and Continental, when it came to medicine, were able to sort of see past the war efforts and try and work together in that sense, which is really going to be interesting. I think some of this funny. I think some of this is going to probably come back a little bit next month, because we're going to be talking about Nathaniel Greene, Hawkirk Hill, and I think there's going to be some things, some common ground with this, because the Battle of Hawkirk Hill, though it wasn't as brutal as Camden, was still produced quite a lot of injuries, quite a lot of sick and ill that came out of that. It really didn't end once the war ended, or once the battles ended. So I think we should all be grateful that places like Camden existed, in the sense that you have to learn. You learn then, so we don't learn now, because the world we live in now, we're thankfully all these advancements, all these things we've learned are hopefully going to carry us forward a little bit better than they would have 225, 30 years ago. Very interesting topic. Very interesting topic.
Thank you very much for having me.
Yeah, absolute pleasure to have you, Jim, as always. Everyone, we will close for now. Next month we'll be talking about, as I just said, Jim, I think you're going to be back next month, please. For Nathaniel Greene, another fascinating guy, and Hopkirk Hill, which we touched on today, but there's a lot about Hopkirk Hill that's we got to discuss. So we'll be back next month, April 4th. We'll be looking forward to it then. So everyone have a good evening and thank you.